You've got no idea what's coming. Americans seem to be blissfully aware of a new great geopolitical order taking shape and how closely it's tied to their everyday financial lives. Ray Dalio saw this coming years ago with the rise of the BRICs alliance and the gradual fall of the dollar as the world reserve currency. This is not financial advice, but we need to revisit what he said because some vital lessons you can learn here. So subscribe to the channel and take a look at this before we dive in.
Right now, the U.S. is imposing sanctions. Sanctions it's a form of economic warfare, and it has a big implication for the dollar, right? Okay, now others are trying to get out of the dollar system. There's a dollar system that now is being changed. India is dealing directly with Russia, and holders of dollar-denominated assets don't want to hold those dollar assets if they feel that they're going to be grabbed and so on. So what's happening now has happened many times before. And without that kind of perspective, I wouldn't be able to deal with it. And I learned this in my past because well, just quickly.
You know, the one thing that in the past 4 years has accelerated even further, it's the lockdowns as a result of the pandemic that laid bare to the entire world just how fragile and interconnected our economies and supply chains are across the world, and by extension, how globalization of the past 50 years had strung all countries in a chain with several weak points that could break. For the United States, it's a massive amount of debt. For China, it was the slowdown of their economy as the world's manufacturing engine. For Taiwan, it was how important yet delicate their semiconductor industry was. For the Gulf region, it was their crude oil reserves. And for Europe, it was the threat of Russian aggression. You might not immediately see how all of that complex interplay of geopolitics ties into the life of the everyday American. Here's a graph that should make sense of that. With the US dollar on a slow but unmistakable decline as the world's reserve currency in the last 10 years, all of it is driven by the emergence of a new multipolar world as countries like China and Russia realize that relying solely on the dollar for international trade means having an Achilles heel that America can strike at any moment with things like economic sanction. That also partly explains why there's been a bullion boom since the turn of the century after the financial crisis of 2008, as the central banks of these countries stash gold worth hundreds of billions of dollars as a way to hold on to the historically reliable form of money between nations.
In 1971, I was clerking on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, and President Nixon gets on and he says, we're not going to give you the gold that the dollar is backed by, and we had a devaluation. It took me by surprise. I walked on the floor of the stock exchange. I thought it was going to go down a lot. It went up a lot. And that's because I never experienced the currency devaluation. I found the same exact thing when I studied history. Same exact announcement took place on March 5th, 1933 by Roosevelt and had the same effect. So I understood then how history before me was important. Studying the Great Depression allowed me and Bridgewater to anticipate the 2008 financial crisis. If I didn't study that, what's happening now is very relevant, is a guide to the past, is a guide to what's happening now.
Isn't that an interesting window into how today's economic troubles can be traced all the way back half a century? Think of every micro and macroeconomic problem America faces right now, and you realize that a lot of it has to do with how the government and central banks got incredible leverage over the economy, with the dollar becoming a mere fiat currency. From the soaring debt over $35 trillion to the cost of living crisis and Americans drowning in individual debt obligation, it was all made possible when the dollar became a currency the US could simply print and control without being pegged to the value of gold. Every dollar that Americans worked for being was inflated with the Fed's new monetary control. That was good for the country at large since US exports to other nations became cheaper. It was also good for the OPEC countries that could price their oil in dollars, but the price was to be borne by the normal citizen who would keep working to chase the ever-elusive purchasing power of his hard-earned dollar.
As we are approaching a challenging of the world order, in other words, a great power challenging another, there is an increased likelihood of some kind of war. There are 5 kinds of wars. There's a trade war, a technology war, a geopolitical influence war, a capital war, which we're in the midst of, and then there's a military war. And those things drive countries to be self-sufficient and independent. And as a result, globalization diminishes and nationalism increases.
Ray Dalio hit the nail on the head with this one because it's an insight that you see across his written work. While most of the world is fixated over globalization and even some notion of a globalist government, a cursory glance at the world today shows you a retreat of that trend over the last few years. You've got Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Javier Milei in Argentina, and then of course Putin and Xi Jinping, who are all trying to retreat and close off their countries into a protective shell, both economically and culturally. But to a degree, we might even see that in the United States if Donald Trump is elected, because he's been very open about his relative isolationism on foreign policy with an America First agenda and trade protectionism, especially against countries like China. Now, if you look at studies from the Watson Institute, it reveals that America's foreign involvement in military interventions in the last 25 years have had a total price tag of over $8 trillion. Who's the one to foot the bill for it? It was the average American, either directly through taxation or indirectly through inflation and loss of purchasing power, as the country printed more and more money to finance its wars and the resulting debt. But as the rest of the world moves further away from reliance on the dollar, this rapid printing of dollars and flooding of the international currency market with dollars will become unsustainable. And we may have started to see the first signs of that happening in the last 5 years with the BRICs alliance.
It affects the value of money most fundamentally. Like what we're seeing now is that the value of money, when you run very large deficits and you have to spend a lot. You have to spend a lot on social programs. You have to spend a lot on defense. You have to spend a lot on environmental programs and so on. And so when you spend a lot more money than you earn, then you have to print money to make up that difference, to make the purchases. And then that devalues money. And so it's like the examples I gave you of the two currency devaluations that you had before. 1971 led to the inflationary period of the 1970s. And so you have the stock market. Yes, the stock market goes up and other things, but cash is trash. And people then begin to learn that the bonds that they're holding have negative returns. And it starts to change the value of money.
This is an early warning for the U.S. to change with the times, because the complacency of the old times when everyone wanted the dollar and only America had the printing machines is soon going to end. That means the country will need to come up with a way to retain its place in the new multipolar world. Even more so now, the dollar will need to compete in the currency market, not just with BRICs, but with the rise of cryptocurrency and digital money. If the dollar fails to do that, it means America losing the greatest financial edge it has had over the world for the last half a century. And it will again be the average working class American that takes the economic hit. Let me know what you think, because it's fascinating to see Ray Dalio's words ring more true as time goes on. All we can do is hope that America's next leaders are also listening close.